Hello and good evening. I hope you had a nice weekend. I want to be discussing something that's been on my mind for some time, and I've in fact talked about it with colleagues and friends. But I thought today, let me spend some time at Giri's Adda and share some of these thoughts. They are, of course, to do with the recent national education policy of 2020 and the attention that it has got. So let me begin by saying that there's a lot of attention that the NEP 2020, as we call it, the national education policy, has been getting. So those of us who work in education have been subjected to a lot of webinars and discussions and so on. And many of us have read through that document. At Giri's Adda, I have done a few episodes on this. I will, of course, as we go along, I will do some more and perhaps summarize some of my thoughts on the NEP at a later stage. But one of the things I feel we have conveniently forgotten in our in the attention that we are showering on the NEP of 2020 is the Right to Education Act of 2010. I want to spend some time looking at these two milestones, so to say, and these two documents to look at what they mean for us and what are the implications. So when the Right to Education Act of 2010 came into being and when it was notified in April 2010, it had become a piece of legislation, a constitutional promise coming to fruition, so to say. And many veterans who were at the forefront of the conception of this landmark legislation, of this fundamental constitutional obligation coming into law, took pains to tell us that it was after a long struggle of nearly 100 years that the act was seeing the light of day. And of course, as they shared these stories, we learned what those struggles were and what the issues were. And we also learned that for several decades, the Indian government just did not bother about education. Or else this act or this law would have come into being perhaps much earlier. Anyway, that's a separate story. I don't want to get into it right now. Maybe some other day we talk about the trajectory of the Right to Education Act. What I want to now do is where does this act stand today and how does it compare with the policy? If figures are to go by, not more than 15% of India's government schools up to the elementary level are RTE compliant, as people would like to put it, which means not more than that number of schools is actually following the legislation in spirit, not only in letter but in spirit. The legislation has got several chapters and several aspects and several dimensions. The ones concerned with school are to do with things like number of teachers, number of teaching hours, the kind of facilities that the school should have, and most importantly, what should happen inside the school, right? What are the processes? So you talk of a fear-free environment, you talk of a teaching learning process that brings the best out of the child, you talk of an assessment process that is continuous. You're not testing the child on some god-forsaken day of the year and pronouncing that boy or girl has passed or failed. So in fact the RTE advocated for continuous assessment and so on. That is one dimension which has been diluted and removed entirely from the Act now through one of the major amendments to the Act. We have brought back examinations and so on. That's another discussion. I don't want to get into it. So basically, these are the aspects that schools should have. And I think the most important thing about the Act is that it is justiciable. Any Act is justiciable, right? We have hundreds of acts in our country. How do you ensure that the Act is implemented? Till a piece of legislation does not give the common man or the common woman the power, till it does not enable them to hold the government of the day accountable, that law is meaningless. So the RTE Act also has those provisions, right? So for example, to safeguard the rights of the child, the Act has the State Commission for Protection of Child Rights, which is an autonomous body which can summon government officers, which can summon even ministers and the government of the day to actually question them as to what is happening on the Act, why certain things have not happened, and so on. The SCPCR falls short of a court. It cannot give a judgment, but then it can cause a lot of discomfort. It can speak truth to power, as it were. It can ask a lot of questions. So what I'm trying to say is a legislation for education is something of a powerful tool in the hands of the common people to ask questions of the government of the day. For example, if there is a shortage of teachers in a particular school, and if people have tried their best to bring this to the notice of the education department or the district administration and nothing has been done, then the Act empowers them to take it to the next level and seek redressal. So there is a grievance redressal mechanism. If, for example, a set of parents feel that the aspect of fear-free environment, the aspect of bringing out the creative potential within children is not being adhered to in school, and on the other hand, either the teachers are not teaching or what they're doing is just rote-based activity, that also can become a potential piece for justiciability in the Act. You can take that matter to court. Not that it has happened, and that's actually a sad thing. We should have actually been having a lot of things happening around the Act, Right to Education Act by way of grievance redressal and so on. Why they haven't happened is also because there is no demand. Who cares for the government schools? Who is willing to spend some time to fight those battles? I think any piece of legislation, if there is no demand from the people who the legislation is for and who are affected by it, I think it just goes into cold storage. That is what has happened to the Right to Education Act. Contrast that with the NEP of 2020. The NEP is a policy document. And what is the difference? A policy is a statement of intent. Of course, it is a policy document has to have a statement of vision for education. Where do we want to take education in this country? What are the values? What are the fundamental principles on which it is based? What do we want it to look like? And what are we willing to do about it? And so on. All of this is a matter of intent. And we of course have a policy after 34 years now in this country. Very long time. A lot of things have changed, including of course now the pandemic, the global pandemic, and no one really knows what kind of impacts it's going to have many years down the line on children, their parents, and on societies. Of course, the NEP 2020 does not address the impacts of the pandemic, and that's a point that we must uh, bear in mind. But all said and done, a policy is not justiciable. It's a statement of intent. Any government of the day will say, look, we intend to do this, this is what we want to do, this is where our heart is, this is where our aspirations are, this is the kind of education we want to see. We want to bring in IT, we want to bring in artificial intelligence, we want to. Many things, of course, in the NEP 2020 are a repeat of what previous policies have stated. So one wonders as to what is different and how are we going to do these things differently. And these are some of the points that I have raised in my earlier episodes at Giri's Adda on the NEP. But then let's understand that while there is a brouhaha around the NEP 2020, let us not forget that 10 years ago we brought into being a landmark legislation that potentially gives us a very powerful tool to fight our battles for education. In 2020, our schools have fundamentally not changed 10 years after this legislation. Of course, one can argue that it is, these things take time and so on. But then one would like to see a trend which shows us, or developments which show promise, which tell us that we are in the direction of making the act a reality. I think we have moved in the opposite direction. Today, hardly anybody talks about the right to education legislation. I have attended a number of webinars on the NEP 2020. Nobody talks about this law and what we should be doing with it and how we should, activate it and revitalize it and make it help us to create a better education system. The one area which has seen the most bitter debates and perhaps the most bitter battles or the most intense battles is in the area of private schools and the 25% quota. The private schools are a very powerful lobby and they have approached the Supreme Court in this regard and so on. So that is one issue that has got a lot of visibility. But the other issues related to right to education, whether they are related to access, infrastructure, basic facilities, teachers, teaching learning, learning outcomes and so on, I think these are not the battlegrounds on which which have seen activity as far as the right to education is concerned. So through this episode, I hope a lot of people working in the field of education, both within government and outside, get this point inside their heads that you need to look at the NEP 2020 in conjunction with the RTE of 2010, which gives us the legal framework to make things happen in education. Nobody is going to hold the government accountable for a policy if it doesn't work after 20 years. But then we have a tool by which we can hold any government of the day, however powerful it may be, accountable for this legislation. So I hope you like this piece of reflection and look forward to your observations and responses on this. And let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep the addebazi going at Giri's Adda. Good night.